Before dawn in a building designed to shine only when the world was watching, a billionaire CEO would pause in the shadows at 4 a.m., transfixed by a janitor's voice echoing through empty marble halls. Unaware that the song he was hearing came from a dream abandoned years earlier for a reason far heavier than failure. Evan Cross adjusted the hood of his faded sweatshirt as he slipped through the side entrance of Crosspoint Technologies, the same building whose grand opening he'd celebrated with champagne and press cameras a decade earlier, now silent except for the low hum of emergency lights and the distant whir of HVAC systems. Because lately something had been gnawing at him despite record profits and glowing quarterly reports. A sense that the soul of his company had thinned as it scaled, that somewhere, between IPOs and investor calls, the people who kept the place running had faded into the background. And that was why he was here before sunrise, unannounced, unrecognized, just another tired contractor walking into a building most executives never saw outside business hours. The elevator doors slid open on the executive floor, revealing polished glass walls, framed innovation awards, and empty corner offices worth more per year than some employees earned in a decade. And that's when Evan noticed the janitor, alone, moving slowly but deliberately, mop gliding across the floor, as if following a rhythm only he could hear. An older man with broad shoulders softened by time, headphones dangling and used around his neck, a worn utility cart beside him, and a name tag that read Marcus R. Though what truly stopped Evan cold wasn't the man or the hour. It was the sound, a low, soulful melody drifting through the corridor, not loud or showy, but rich and controlled, the kind of voice that carried years of feeling in every note. The kind that didn't belong in an empty office tower at 4 a.m., and Evan found himself frozen near a glass conference room, listening as Marcus sang softly while wiping fingerprints from a mahogany table, his voice rising and falling with aching restraint, singing about lost time, promises made under city lights, and roads not taken. The lyrics so personal they felt overheard rather than performed. Evan had heard countless performers at corporate galas and charity events, but this was different, unguarded, unpolished, real. And when Marcus finally noticed he wasn't alone, the song cut off mid-phrase as if someone had pulled a plug, his shoulders tensing instantly. "Sorry, sir," Marcus said quickly, eyes darting to Evan's shoes as if bracing for a complaint. "I didn't think anyone was up here yet." And Evan forced a casual shrug, lowering his voice. "Didn't mean to interrupt. Just long night," to which Marcus nodded with a tired smile that suggested long nights were his default setting, returning to his mop with quiet efficiency. Evan lingered, pretending to check his phone while his mind raced, because nothing about this felt accidental. Not the hour, not the voice, not the way Marcus worked like he had something to prove, even when no one was watching. And when Evan finally struck up conversation, asking how long he'd been on shift, whether the building was always this quiet, Marcus answered politely but guardedly, explaining he preferred the overnight schedule because it's easier when the building's empty, a line delivered with practiced neutrality that hinted at years of learning not to take up too much space. As they spoke, Evan's eyes drifted to the janitor's cart, where tucked between cleaning supplies was a creased piece of paper held in place with tape, yellowed at the edges, and when he leaned closer he recognized it instantly. Not a schedule or checklist, but an old concert flyer, the kind printed cheaply for small venues, featuring a younger man with the same unmistakable eyes and a headline that read, "Marcus Reed, one night only," followed by the name of a long-closed downtown music hall. And Evan felt a strange tightening in his chest as he realized this wasn't just a hobby. This was something Marcus had once chased hard enough to print flyers for. When Evan asked about it, Marcus hesitated, then let out a small laugh that carried no humor, peeling the flyer off the cart as if embarrassed to be caught with it. "Old life," he said simply, folding it with care and slipping it into his pocket, adding, "Doesn't matter now," before changing the subject and asking if Evan needed help finding an office. But the words didn't sit right. Not with the way Marcus's voice had filled the corridor moments earlier, not with the reverence he showed that scrap of paper. And as Evan rode the elevator back down alone, the song replayed in his head, mixing with questions he hadn't planned to ask on this undercover visit. Who was Marcus Reed before the mob? What had pushed him here? And how many other people in Evan's company were carrying buried dreams through the night while the world slept. Because somewhere between the hum of the elevator and the first hint of dawn breaking through the glass atrium, Evan Cross realized he hadn't just stumbled onto a talented janitor cleaning floors at 4 a.m. He'd stumbled onto a story his company had ignored for years, and something told him this was only the beginning. By the second morning, Evan Cross found himself awake before his alarm, the janitor's voice from the night before still echoing in his head. And by 3:45 a.m., he was already pulling on the same worn hoodie, driven by a restlessness he hadn't felt since the early days of building his company from a rented office and sleepless nights. Because this undercover visit was no longer about metrics or morale reports. It was about understanding how a man with that kind of voice had ended up alone on the executive floor with a mop and a bucket. When Evan stepped off the elevator just after 4 a.m., Marcus was already there, carefully wiping down the glass walls of the boardroom, his movements slower than before, as if his body carried a quiet ache he'd learned to work around. And though there was no singing this time, the rhythm was still there in the way he moved, measured and patient. Evan greeted him casually, and Marcus nodded, offering the same polite smile. But there was a flicker of recognition now, a subtle awareness that this wasn't a one-off encounter, and after a few minutes of small talk, Evan gently asked about the flyer again, careful not to sound like a boss prying into a personal life. Marcus was silent for a long moment, then sighed, leaning his mop against the wall as if surrendering to a memory he usually kept locked away, and told Evan that once, a long time ago, music hadn't been something he did in secret, it had been the center of his life. He talked about open mics that turned into paid gigs, late nights in cramped studios, and a small but growing following that made him believe, just for a moment, that he might actually make it, that his voice might carry him somewhere brighter than graveyard shifts and empty hallways. But life, Marcus explained quietly, had a way of interrupting dreams without asking permission, and when his mother got sick, everything else fell away, because hospital bills didn't care about talent and record labels didn't wait for sons who needed to be at a bedside. He sold his guitar, skipped auditions, and took the first steady job he could find, telling himself it was temporary, just until things stabilized. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when responsibilities piled up and the world kept moving. What struck Evan most wasn't the bitterness Marcus didn't express, but the calm acceptance in his voice, as if he'd long ago made peace with the idea that some dreams were meant to be sacrificed so others could survive. And as they talked, Evan began to notice details he'd missed before. The way Marcus winced when bending to wring out the mop, the braces on his worn shoes, the faint tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. Signs of a man who worked far past what his body should have allowed, not out of ambition, but necessity. Over the next hour, Evan watched Marcus do far more than clean, quietly restocking supplies for the day crew, fixing a jammed paper towel dispenser, and jotting notes about spills on floors that weren't even part of his assigned route. And when Evan asked why he bothered, Marcus shrugged and said, "If I don't do it now, someone else has to do it later." A simple answer that revealed a deeper pattern of putting others first, even when no one would ever know. It wasn't until Evan overheard two early-arriving security guards greeting Marcus by name and thanking him for covering their area the week before that he began to understand the scope of what management reports never captured, that Marcus was a quiet pillar in a system that barely acknowledged him. As dawn crept closer and the building began to stir, Evan asked the question that had been weighing on him since the night before, whether Marcus ever thought about going back to music, and Marcus paused, looking out at the city lights fading into morning, before admitting that he still sang sometimes, not for crowds or money, but because it reminded him of who he used to be, and because giving it up entirely felt like losing the last piece of himself. He explained that he worked nights so he could send money to his sister and still make it to her kids' school events during the day, that the quiet hours were easier because no one expected anything from him except clean floors. And as he said it, Evan felt a sharp, uncomfortable realization settle in, that the man standing in front of him embodied loyalty, sacrifice, and humility on a level his company praised in speeches but failed to protect in practice. When the first wave of employees arrived, Marcus excused himself, slipping back into the background as naturally as he'd stepped into Evan's awareness. And as Evan rode the elevator down again, this time with the building waking up around him, he knew the undercover phase of his visit was nearly over, because what he'd learned wasn't something he could file away in a report or address with a memo. It demanded action, and as sunlight finally spilled across the lobby, Evan Cross understood that before he could fix systems or culture, he would have to start by doing right by the man whose voice had filled an empty building at 4 a.m. and exposed everything that had been quietly broken. The third morning came with a clarity Evan Cross hadn't felt in years, the kind that settles in when a decision has already been made and all that remains is the courage to follow through. And instead of pulling on a hoodie, he walked into Crosspoint Technologies in a tailored suit, arriving just after sunrise as employees gathered for an unscheduled company-wide meeting, unaware that the quiet janitor they passed every day without a glance had become the center of something much larger. Marcus was halfway through his usual routine when a security supervisor approached him, gently asking him to attend the meeting, and no confusion crossed his face. He followed, still carrying the posture of someone who expected to remain unseen. Evan stood on the stage, scanning the crowd before beginning not with numbers or strategy, but with a story about walking through the building at 4 a.m. and hearing a voice that didn't belong to the shadows, a voice that carried sacrifice, talent, and years of unrecognized dedication. And as murmurs spread through the room, he called Marcus forward, watching as the man hesitated, then stepped into the light with quiet dignity. Evan spoke plainly, revealing that Marcus had once given up a promising music career to care for family, that he had worked nights to support others, and that he had gone above and beyond without recognition because he believed in doing the right thing even when no one was watching. And in that moment, the room shifted as employees saw not a janitor, but a person whose values mirrored the very mission statements hanging on their walls. Evan announced immediate changes, living wage adjustments, expanded healthcare support, and a new creative sabbatical program for employees who had shelved passions to survive. But then he turned back to Marcus and addressed him directly, explaining that his medical debts had been cleared, his hours restructured, and his job redefined so he would never again have to choose between dignity and stability. Finally, Evan invited Marcus to do the one thing he'd only done in secret for years, and as the lights dimmed and a single microphone was placed on stage, Marcus sang, his voice filling the auditorium the same way it once filled empty hallways. Only now it was heard, honored, and shared, and when the last note faded, the applause wasn't polite or performative, it was grateful. In the weeks that followed, Marcus returned to work by choice, not necessity, mentoring others and singing openly during company events, while Evan remained more present than ever, reminded daily that leadership wasn't about being seen at the top, but about listening closely enough to hear the dreams echoing quietly at 4 a.m., waiting for someone to care.